God's Unchanging Word Studios in New Orleans. We are pleased to bring you news, nuggets, and insights with today's host, Tom Carey.
Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to God's Unchanging Word in another edition for our news, nuggets, and insights. Today is Friday, January 1st, 2021. Very first program for a new year. And as always, we've got a lot to talk about today. Let's get right into it. COVID-19, the cost. We began last week talking about how expensive COVID is. The truth is, nobody really knows, but just keeps adding the dollars. Today, we're going to talk about the hypocrisy of the debt relief package program that just came out. And then we're going to talk about the debt of America and how it's beginning to ignite the beast that we talk about and we understand from Revelation. And then we're going to tie it all into the beast of Revelation and how all this matches up and pulls all these stories together today in our nuggets portion of the program. So let's begin with the COVID-19 update and the cost. Last week we asked the question, does anyone really know how much COVID-19 is costing America? There's only one example that we found that came in from a research that was done from Harvard, believe it or not, Harvard economists. They estimate approximately $16 trillion as everything's taken into account and ends by this fall. But now we're talking about going into a decade. In fact, for the first time last night, I heard someone saying that this is going to continue to evolve, that this could last us for another 10 years. Then where in the world is that coming from? It's amazing how much is tied into 2030. Everything we seem to talk about now evolves around 2030. So now let's get right into this. The COVID relief hypocrisy. Did you get your $600 check yet? You can't help but to demand you just to mock what's going on here. And actually I have a video today. There's got a lot of humor in it in talking about the relief. COVID-19, the hypocrisy of the cost to the nation in this package. So now, what's in the COVID-19 relief package? We're going to talk a little bit about that. It's 900 pages. 5,593 pages and $900 billion for the relief program. And it's tied into a $1.4 trillion emergency package to keep the government open. I think we ought to keep that $1.4 trillion and shut the government down. Who needs them when you think about this? Man, it's the one who keeps getting us in all these problems. So now I've got a video. This is by Tucker Carlson. So you're going to have some sarcasm into it, kind of like I'm doing here now. But he brings in a lot of where the money's going to and begins to talk about some of the hypocrisy. So you ready? Let's play that video.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Relief is finally here. After tense negotiations and multiple rounds of televised theatrics, the Congress has passed a definitive spending bill. It's 5,593 pages long. It amounts to $2.3 trillion. That includes nearly $1 trillion in COVID relief. All of it comes right from the U.S. Treasury, which is busy printing it right now. That's a lot of money. On the other hand, there's a lot of need. Thanks in part to government lockdowns, more than 100 million Americans are out of the workforce tonight. 1 in 6 restaurants is closed. Huge parts of the retail sector are in tatters. J.Crew is in bankruptcy, so is Pier 1, Neiman Marcus, Brooks Brothers, Century 21, many others. So if there was ever a time that Americans need relief, it's right now. So be glad to know there is something for you in this bill. It is entirely possible that you could get a $600 check courtesy of the U.S. Congress. That money, should you receive it, is yours to keep. Do what you wish. Buy a moderately sized television set and watch the free channels all night if you want. Rent a Tesla for a day and drive it till the power runs out. Or splurge and order 2 full appetizers right off the tasting menu at the French Laundry in Napa. Tip not included. Whatever. The sky's the limit here. Go crazy. $600, all for you. It's good to be an American. On the other hand, it's also pretty good to be a Jordanian. This same bill, passed but not read by the United States Congress, allocates $500 million for border security in Jordan. That's enough cash to buy the French Laundry in Napa a couple times over. But that's not what the money's for. Congress wants to help Jordan build a wall along its 275-mile-long border with Syria. Apparently, Congress is worried about illegal immigration over there, and you can see why. Illegal immigration is illegal, and that's bad. And that's why Congress allocated another $250 million for additional border security in Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, and Oman. God knows those countries need it. Borders make a nation. Remember that. Except here, in the United States, which is unique among nations through history, borders are not relevant. In fact, borders are racist. And that's why this very same bill, which does so much for the Jordanians and the Egyptians and the Lebanese and the Tunisians and the people of Oman, defunds American border security. And ladies and gentlemen, we need that defunding. That way we won't be bigots. So the bill slashes funding for ICE detention space and blocks a request to hire more deportation officials. Excuse me. It catches in the throat. Immigration authorities in this country will have, I beg your pardon, 11,000 fewer detention beds starting this year. And if that hurts, imagine all of those people moving here permanently. They'll have to. Problem solved. It's not like they're trying to sneak into Jordan. Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy is excited about this. He bragged about it in a press release today. There's also, you should know, $33 million in the bill for what are called democracy programs in Venezuela, because we're experts on democracy. We're spending $231 million to help pay down the national debt of Sudan. And of course, that's another area of expertise for us, national debt. Meanwhile, the bill, and you want to know this for certain, spends huge amounts of money to diversify the workforce in our so-called intelligence community. That's another key national security objective. And just in case you were worried that American society wasn't yet divided enough, this bill creates 2 new monuments to the interest groups that have the most political power at the moment. So henceforth, the Smithsonian will create a women's history museum, as well as what's called the National Museum of the American Latino. And that's just here in America. There's a whole lot more for the rest of the world. This bill spends $10 million on what it calls gender programs in Pakistan. Now, Congress doesn't specify exactly what those are.
It also talked about $20 million down in Venezuela, a country where they fought to remove the president who's still there today. The hypocrisy of it all is just absolutely unbelievable. In a time where we have no money, there's no money to do this. It's being printed up. It's going in debt. So while we do this, as you can see on the border, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in just a second, our debt continues to rise. Now we're going to borrow money to go pay other people's debt down in other countries. Hundreds of billions of dollars going to foreign countries, but you get your $600. So you can see the sarcasm of what's going on here to the American public. Now let's talk a little bit more about that. Stop building the border wall. Almost $750 million going out to other countries to help them with their borders. But we're going to stop building the border wall here. Biden proudly declares not another foot of wall built if I'm president. This is what his campaign, when he ran on it, and he said recently he will stand by that the day he takes office. Not another foot of wall is going to go into. He said there will not be another foot of wall constructed in my administration, which is strange considering he actually voted to build 700 miles of the wall in 2006. He voted to build it. But now, as the sarcasm was in Tucker Carlson, it's racist to build walls. That's part of the prophecy when God talked about he would remove our hedge of protection. He also said he'd remove the wisdom from the wise, and that's where we are today in the United States. Look at this New York Post. This is the newspaper cover. They call it stocking stuffers. Stimulus has millions of dollars in pork and peanuts for you. It's going across the whole country, and everybody understands that. Billions in foreign aid, pet projects stuffed in the COVID relief bill, the second largest omnibus bill ever for the American people. Legislators had a whole 2 hours to read the 5,500 plus pages before they voted on it. Does it remind you of we have to pass the bill to know what's in it? Well, pretty much that was what was done here. This is the way Congress now has been doing business for a long, long time. Things they know that no one would ever approve of, no one would ever endorse, they throw them all together, they lump them into one bill that has to be done, because if they didn't pass this bill, the government would have to shut down on Tuesday, the day we're taping today. Well, it might have been a good idea. I don't know. Just something to think about. 5,500 pages. The legislature put it together, and they had 2 hours to read it. Well, you know, it's absolutely impossible. I've got some more here. I'm going to share these with you. What is some of the money going to? $500 million earmarked for an Israeli defense purchase, including the equipment of the Iron Dome missile defense system. $250 million over 5 years for the Pakistani economic aid, which was pushed by the Democratic Representative Nittany Lowley. $101 million to combat transnational threat of wildlife poaching and trafficking. $2.5 million for internet freedom programs in closed societies. $10 million for gender programs. I don't know, $10 million for gender programs? That's just for one country. There's 2 or 3 countries they have this in there, meant to help women get education and start business in Pakistan. The Post also mentioned at least 8 foreign countries receiving aid, including Egypt, Sudan, the Ukraine, and according to the Post, Egypt would get $1.3 billion just for Egypt alone. There's more. Domestic funding, the Kennedy Center, $26.4 million. The Smithsonian, $1 billion. National Art Gallery, $154 million. The National Arts and Humanities, $167 million. And the W. Wilson Center, $14 million. I never knew what that was yet. I need to take a moment to go back and see, what is the Wilson Center? Foreign countries, here's where it breaks down. Egypt, $1.3 billion. Sudan, $700 million. Ukraine, $453 million. Israel, $500 million. Nepal, $130 million. Burma, $135 million. Cambodia, $85 million. Pakistan, $25 million. And Asia or IA, I'm not sure what that is either, $1.4 billion that goes to them. Now understand, we need to remember, you see all of this? We're $27 trillion in debt. And we're going to give away all of this. So we're going to borrow money to go give to somebody with what we don't agree with. Well, God's right. He said he's going to remove the wisdom of the wise. And then Isaiah said, we're sick from the head to the foot. Well, here you have it. But then it comes out, well, that's not fair to the Americans since they're footing the bill. Let's give them 2,000, and that's been voted down, at least at this stage. So think about it. So where is all this leading to? Well, it's going to lead to the detriment of the United States and the collapse of our nation. Look what Deuteronomy 28 says, verse 33 and 34. It says, the fruit of your land and all your labors, a nation which you do not know shall eat it up. All right, let's stop for just a second. You know, years ago when I first came into church and I would read scriptures like this, in my mind, I assumed that a nation would come in and take it from us. I never dreamed that those who've been voted in office, who have the decision of how they're going to govern your money, your tax money, is going to take it and give it away. So here's what's going on. While you, is what the scripture says, through your labors, what does that mean? Is that through your hard work, your tax dollar, all the time and the energy you put into paying your taxes, state, federal, city, local, food, sales, you name it, property taxes. All of these things eventually go into a building of a society where now the leaders of the nation say, well, we're going to take that money now, which is your labors, and back when they were an agrarian society that you're seeing here in Deuteronomy 28, where they grew produce, and this is what basically this is talking about, because your dollar is what you're growing through your work efforts today, is all going to be taken and given to another nation. Because that's what's happening. So what you're witnessing, whether you realize it or not, is the prophecy of the curses that come upon a nation when you're disobedient to God. There it is. That's just the beginning. That's only a part of what's going on here. Let's go on. Where it says, and you shall be only oppressed and crushed always. It says, and so you shall be mad for the sight of your eyes, which you shall see. So now, absolutely. Anybody see this make you mad? That's what God says. Well, you're going to see it. It's going to make you mad. And it does. This is absolutely horrendous. And it just continues to go on and on and on. Every year it goes on the same way. And the problem is there is no way to pay this debt down. Let me show you a little bit later about that. Going on. How does this affect the debt in the Wall Street? Well, prophecy said that these are going to come to pass. I showed this to you last week. This was showing you where we are in the national debt. Let me blow that up again. $27.446 trillion in debt. This is absolutely unbelievable. This has doubled in the last 4 years alone of our debt. 9 trillion, 9 trillion, 9 trillion. So now, in 1 week, now take a look. Let's leave that up there, Jeff, for just a few minutes here. Let me show you this. So now, last week I showed you it was 27.446 trillion. And so this week, when at the same time I did this chart, was 27.541. So just under $100 billion in debt. $100 billion in debt in just 1 week. That's unbelievable. That's what's going on. But it doesn't matter. We've got plenty of money. We're going to give it away to all those other nations. That $2.3 trillion is not added into this yet. Now, depending on when they actually give away the money, then actually gets registered on the books, that 27 trillion is going to continue to grow. In fact, it wouldn't be unusual to be close to 30 trillion by mid next year now with the $2.3 trillion. So it just continues to grow and grow, but it gets better than that. Let's go on. Let me show you something else. I've got a video feed here that we're going to play you. No music, so there'll be no music to it, so no sound, nothing else. I just want you to take a look at this debt clock for 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. And watch how fast the numbers spin and try to comprehend a little bit of what you're seeing. I'm showing this because a lot of people who don't have internet can't get this live debt clock. This is a live debt clock in real time that I copied just 2 minutes of yesterday. Let's play that. All right, now, let me just, while you're looking at that clock, in the upper left-hand corner, that's how fast, look at those numbers, how they're moving. And on the bottom is talking about the actual debt, right next to that, right underneath it, you see how fast that's going? That's the federal deficit spending. Look how fast they're spending to add to that debt. Now, when you go off to the right, I'm showing you that box over there is in green. That's actually money that's coming in. So you say, wow, that's great because that should be offsetting the negative. No, it doesn't. And I'm going to show you why. But just take a minute to look at that. And then when it's finished, I'll come back and I'm going to bring up a couple boxes and show you what I'm talking about. Doesn't that seem like forever? that was 2 minutes. And Deuteronomy comes to mind. Doesn't it make you mad because you're watching this debt? There's no way to stop that. And when the government gets up there and all the hypocrisy of our senators and our congressmen and everybody who's out there leading the nation talking about how great they are, it don't work. There's nothing can stop what's going on here. We have passed the time of no return. But that's what's going on. That's in real time. So what did we just look at? You just watched in 2 minutes an additional $5.34 million added to our debt. Try to sink that into your head. $5.34 million that was just added to our debt in those 2 minutes. And it doesn't get any better. Now, if you're looking at the clock and you go back and forth month by month or day by day, it'll add up faster, add up little, and it all depends on when they actually take the money they're spending and add it to the bottom line. Then it begins to throw everything out of whack. So that's what you're looking at when we see that there right now. So now, let's take a look at something here that we've been talking about here in the church, in our sermons, in the programs we've been developing, and especially on the prophecy timeline, what's called the Minsky moment, which is the financial crisis that's awaiting. All right, that's what's coming. What the government called the Minsky moment. I'm going to show you a chart. We're going to pull it out of Roaring Sea. So what we're looking at right now in 2021, if I'm reading the news events properly, what we're beginning to see is that all the pieces of the puzzle that we've been putting together for the last 7 years, these pieces of the puzzle now are all falling in place, and they're coming together from various different angles in different positions, different leaderships, different countries, and they're now beginning to put the picture together to begin to merge and begin to work. What the Bible said is going to happen at the end times. 2021 appears to be the year when all of this begins to take place. You with me? All right, so now let's go through this. Let's take a look at it, what's going on here. Now, this is one of the boxes I showed you in that live stream on the green. I said we're going to talk about in just a second. Then we're going to compare it with this box down here. So let's blow up the first one. This is the federal tax revenue. This is what's coming in as of this year, $3.4 trillion, which seems like a lot of money. Well, the problem is we just spent $3.9 trillion. Well, that's a real problem. But now, bear with me here, that $3.9 trillion wasn't to pay the debt. You with me? That's to pay the interest on the debt. Just the interest. The Minsky moment says is when it reaches the point where it takes all of the government money that we produce in our income for the federal government to pay the interest. When we can no longer do that, it begins to move into the time frame they call the Minsky moment. Now, what is that? You're in the foundational period now, which the government forecasted before the 2020 COVID crisis was going to take place in 2024. But because we have spent so much money this year and taken in so much less in revenue, why? Because we shut our country down and gave away everything, and we continue to give it all away. And because of that, the Minsky moment now is moving further and further to the day, and it appears we are already there. Because with this chart, we have already seen this year that we have spent $432 billion more just to pay the interest due. Just for the interest. That means not one penny of income goes to pay down the debt. I don't care what government official you listen to on TV. I don't care if you're listening to Fox. I don't care if you're listening to CNN. If anybody tells you any different than the facts and the figures that you're looking at here, they're lying to you. Everything else is a smokescreen. None of it will work. These are actual figures coming off the U.S. debt clock that they themselves put forth to the American people. We had to borrow this year $432 billion, not just to keep the government open, just to pay the interest that comes due. And that's not going to get any better, brethren. It's only going to get worse. Now, does Deuteronomy come to life again and say, man, why are we giving this to these other countries? Doesn't that make you angry? That's what the scripture says. Whether you realized it or not, that prophecy that you see in Deuteronomy, the curse that God said was going to come, is here before you today. It's real, it's alive, and it will not get better unless this nation repents. Now, I spent a lot of time on this, just a couple of little areas, because it's really important that I get this concept in everybody's mind, where we're going to. because it's so important, as I've been saying for years now, get your homes in order. Now, I don't know how much longer we can go. You'd have never dreamed 4 years ago you could get to 27 trillion and things, everybody's talking about how great it is. But at some point in time, when they no longer accept the U.S. dollar as the standard for which everyone governs themselves by, it will begin to fall apart, and it's going to fall apart very, very quickly. So now, let's go on. History's going to repeat itself. I want to talk about this now, because now I'm going to bring in something that I hadn't talked about in the past, didn't quite understand until I began looking at what's going on today. And this is why I think 2021 is going to be the beginning of all these things coming into play. Hitler was in control for 6 years when he declared war. But he didn't sit for 6 years idly. He was building a war machine behind the scenes. And then while he built his war machine, he said he was building it for peace. Well, that didn't work. Remember the Prime Minister of Great Britain says, peace in our time. When Chamberlain met with Adolf Hitler, he came back waving his document saying, peace in our time, peace in our time, while Hitler was going on, beginning to attack other nations. Germany and the Great Depression, 29 through 1933, is actually what put Adolf Hitler into power. It was in 1929 that the Wall Street crash had led to the worldwide depression. Germany suffered more than any other nation as a result of the recall of U.S. loans, which caused its economy to collapse. Unemployment rocketed, poverty soared, and Germans became desperate. They became so desperate they said, anybody who can help us out of this, we'll take them. Well, it began with the collapse of democracy in Germany. And it brought in the dictator, Adolf Hitler, who began to bring them to their ruin. That was in 1933. So for 6 years, he began behind the scenes working to build his war machine to take over the world and usher in his 1,000-year reich. The target primarily was the Jews. He had to eradicate the Jews so that he can control the rest of the world. They were the blight on our society. Now, in this day, as history repeats itself, it has been 6 years since we saw the establishment of the 2015 layout by the Pope right here in the United States of his 2030 agenda. And now it's all beginning to fall in place. So for the last 6 years, we have witnessed all these nations, including the Pope, the UN, and everyone on the side of the left with the green movement begin to bring into play what they're going to use to bring down this world. The target will be God's elect toward the end time. I'm going to bring you in one chart now. This one chart came from about a year and a half ago from Roaring Seas. 2015, with the 2030 agenda was established. It was quite interesting. It was by 2018 that the scientists had claimed we had 12 years to save the world, which, by the way, was also the length of time that Hitler was in power before the nation of Israel was established. Total of 15 years in totality from the time of 2015 to 2030. It's also the same time with Adolf Hitler from 1933 to 1948 in the establishment of Israel today in the Middle East. The warnings began for God's people in 2014, 2015 with the blood moon tetrads. Was the 8th time that this actually took place since the time of Christ, 8 being new beginnings. We can look back now when everybody said that meant nothing to show that began the movement of a new phase toward an end-time return of Jesus Christ as we were looking back. In addition to that, we talked about how the roaring seas would begin to take place and things would begin to move more and more escalated as times went. 2017 showed the time of the signs of the first coming and the signs of the preparation for the second coming of Jesus Christ, as you see in Revelation chapter 12. All of these things began to fall in place. The 3.5 years for Jesus Christ in his first ministry, where God said he would be cut off in midstream, midweek, as he would prepare for his second coming. So now we begin to see all of these things again lining up. It's interesting that the next 3.5 years begin at 2021, which was 6 years now since the beginning of the introduction of the 2030 agenda. 2021 is going to be a year that we will probably not forget, unlike 2020, which we can't forget. We also brought out back then, we began to introduce the concept of the Minsky moment. That was the very first time we brought it up and showed how it was actually the government's timetable that brought it up and what they were beginning to expect. We showed then that the possibility at that time of 7 years of lean and eventually bringing to 7 years of plenty, like the duality of Joseph, bringing us to the 2030 agenda, Satan's removal at that particular time. By the way, if you're new to the program, you'll see that this picture is actually a picture of the Vatican Hall. They actually built it to look like a serpent, of all things. From the outside, you see it looks like a serpent's head. The irony of all of this is like Satan, who just takes this and just throws it in everyone's face and mocks the world with his deception. So here we have the 2024 Minsky moment. So from 2019, when we began to introduce this, we had 11 years left. And as the people in the world were saying, we've got 11 years to save the world. They talked about the soul of America, remember? So all of these things were beginning to play. Then came 2020, which we didn't know about. And eventually, everything now has shifted. The Minsky moment, as I just showed you from that chart, we are already there, whether they calculate it or not. The actual Minsky moment, when it actually takes place, shows it is the collapse. It is the beginning of the fall and the collapse. So what we have today, while it's not there collapsing, you have everything you need when God decides to pull the plug, and everything will come down rather quickly. All of this beginning to line up. All ties into what we see in pre-World War II. The Roaring Seas explains a lot of this we talked about. Now watch this with Ephraim. Now a lot of people in the church understand Ephraim to be, and they understand as one of Joseph's sons. They believe it's Great Britain. We believe it's actually the United States, and I'm not going to go into that today, but just bear with that, and we can go back and we can prove it out later, because you see, Ephraim's involved at the end time, not Great Britain, the United States is. Ephraim being the younger of the two brothers. Look what it says in Isaiah 28. Woe to the crown of pride. Now that's what the United States is gone. The pride of America is gone. It's finished. You know, it's been washed out for a long, long time. To the drunkards of Ephraim, the Bible talks about the drunkards being filled with sin and frivolity with Babylon toward the end time. Of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is fading flower, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. It says, behold, has the Lord, mighty and a strong one, which is a tempest of hail and a destroying storm. God talks about coming upon the nation of Ephraim, a destroying storm as a flood of mighty waters overflowing shall cast down. When you see this, you talked about the mighty waters and the overflowing. These are primarily refers to as armies. The armies of the nation. And we see Revelation talking about the growing of the armies. Right now, what are we talking about in Europe? They're talking about building their own armies. They can no longer count on the United States for protection. So now they're beginning to prepare their own armies. China now has the largest military of any nation on the face of the earth. They don't yet have all the power that the United States has as the arsenal, but they're gaining it because they're stealing it from them, or our own people are selling it to them as traitors. But that is going on right now. And then it says, the crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim shall be trodden underfoot. That is a prophecy for this nation. How does it go? How does it begin? So how does it take place? Pope Francis and Joe Biden now are connecting. Now, isn't that amazing? That the United States now, with a Catholic president connecting to the Pope, Pope Francis adopts Joe Biden's slogan, Build Back Better. This just came out this past 2 weeks ago. It says this theme of the election celebration is building back better toward a disability-inclusive, accessibility, sustainable, post-COVID-19 world. The Pope wrote in his message this week for the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, while adding, I find the expression building back better quite striking. which fits into his motive of sustainable development goals. We've seen that. We began to talk about that a year and a half ago in Roaring Seas. We talked about the physical and the spiritual. If you haven't seen that series recently, or if you have never seen it, go online, take a look, and you need to see each one of these sermons. I believe there's only 2, and it's filled with a lot of information, first-time information that was ever be able to put together in our sermons. It talks about the beast rising out of the sea, as God talked about that. He says, and I stood on the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his 10 horns were 10 crowns, and upon his head was the name of blasphemy, and that's what we see through the Pope in the Catholic Church, the name of blasphemy. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk about how all this comes to pass. And how does it all come to pass? Through debt. Right, through debt, and what they're going to use to accomplish this through green, the debt and the green. So in the meantime, take a break, take a look at this video here by What is Big Green by PreWorld, and I'll be back in just about 5 minutes.
You've heard a lot about big oil, big pharma, big tech, and all the other big bad players out there. I want to talk to you about the biggest, baddest one of them all. This Goliath doesn't deal in billions, it deals in trillions. I'm talking about Big Green. Yes, the environmental movement. It's the richest, most powerful big in the world right now. Nothing else even comes close. Until we see it for what it is and rein it in, it's going to get even bigger. And as is usually the case, bigger is not always better. You see, Big Green wants to take over your life. It has to. This makes perfect sense. Big Green, after all, intends to save the planet from oblivion. Your freedom would seem to be a small price to pay. To accomplish its mission, Big Green needs 2 things, money and power. It already has a lot of both, but it's hungry for much more. Who do we mean when we say Big Green? We mean the major organizations that set the agenda for the movement. This would include, among dozens, Greenpeace, 350.org, Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, and of course, the politicians, bureaucrats, corporations, and media outlets who support and promote their agenda. Before we get any deeper into this, let's stipulate a few things. The climate is changing. It appears, though we can't be sure, to be slowly warming. If it continues to warm, it could cause serious environmental problems sometime in the distant future. Industrialization probably plays a role in this warming process. Reasonable people should be able to agree on this. Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi and Republican leader Newt Gingrich actually once sat down together and said as much in a public service ad they made in the 1990s. But Big Green has no interest in being reasonable. Reasonable doesn't get you money. Reasonable doesn't get you power. So let's talk about the money. Greenpeace, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and Sierra Club all have financial assets in the $100 to $300 million range. Name a Fortune 500 company, and chances are they're writing big checks to Big Green. Banking giant Citigroup, for example, has committed $100 billion to combat climate change. But the real money is at the government level. In 2009, the Obama administration directed more than $110 billion to be spent on renewable energy investments under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act alone. What the taxpayer got for this investment, other than long-forgotten $500 million boondoggles like Solyndra, is hard to say. According to the best economic models, the Paris Climate Accord will cost the world $1 to $2 trillion every year. Total cost for the Green New Deal, $52 trillion, minimum. But money is only a means to an end. The end is power. The power to transform society into what they think it should be. That's what this is really about. Here's how Shoykot Chakrabarty, the architect of the Green New Deal, described it to the Washington Post. It wasn't originally a climate thing at all. We really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing. Maybe you like all this, that's fine. But don't pretend it's about protecting the environment. Chakrabarty was being honest. You should be too. It's about transferring more and more power to the government at every level, federal, state, local. And the way to get the power is to gin up scary scenarios. The planet is burning. The seas are rising. We're all going to be dead soon unless we listen to those masters of disaster, Al Gore, Bill McKibben, and Greta Thunberg. And what have all their horror stories led to? A generation of young people who have nightmares about a planet burning up around them. Poor people who pay higher energy bills than they need to because of massive subsidies for wind and solar power. Millions of birds, including endangered ones, dying, sliced to pieces by wind turbines. Yet in the midst of all the planet is burning fear-mongering, the world is cleaner, healthier, and richer than it has ever been. Deaths from natural disasters are at all-time lows. Here's why. Human beings adapt when faced with climate problems. We're really good at it. We've been doing it for thousands of years. Sea levels rising, build taller and better seawalls. That's what the Netherlands did. A good chunk of the country, including its international airport, is below sea level. Need more water? Spread the gospel of drip irrigation and desalinization. Israel has more water than it needs, and it's in the middle of a desert. Need clean energy? Build more nuclear power plants. Sweden gets half of its energy from nuclear. None of these simple, practical solutions makes much of an impact on Big Green. You don't raise money off of common sense, and you don't get political power telling people how good things are, and you certainly don't become famous by being calm. Big Green is not poor, not honest, and certainly not powerless. It's time we all plug into that truth. I'm Rogan O'Hanley, aka DC Drano, for Prager University.
What's really amazing about this is if they didn't bring in the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel. And they brought these two factors in that have been right on target for what God talked about in the warning of prophecy at the end time of what's coming. So while they put together the power from the city, the state to the federal, what he stopped short at is now taking the federal and giving it all to a global governing system, which God talks about is Babylon. So now let's go down and take a look at that. So let's go take a look and see what we're talking about with the end time, the debt, and the rise of the beast. We actually began talking about this as early as February 15, 2019, how the world and the Pope was going to use the green as the way to accomplish putting it all together into a one world governance. Now notice I didn't say government, because they can't get all the governments to come together, but they can get the governments to submit to being governed, which is what's going to happen here in the United States. This is a chart that we brought out way back then when they talked about the Green New Deal. This is what they said they have to do. Remove all fossil fuels, which includes automobiles, trains, trucks, airplanes, tractors, and boats. They all have to go green because they need fossil fuel. They have to be removing the fossil fuels. Then they'd have to refit every building for their utilities. And how many buildings was that? Well, it was quite a lot. That would require a minimum of 30,000 homes and businesses a day for 10 years. A day, 30,000. Well, that seems like that's doable, right? And including the power grids of every city that lights up the U.S. You see, so from the beginning, what they're talking about accomplishing is impossible. It can't be done. Certainly not by 2030. Then they had to do away with cows passing gas. Remember that? Actually, I had a couple of comical cartoons I put up there, so now let me just take them out of there. So I didn't want to just mess up the program and get too sarcastic, as we did at the beginning of the program with Tucker Carlson. It was called the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDG. It was quietly brought out at the UN, but it really wasn't understood what he was trying to say right here in America in 2015. It was first introduced as a single global UN objective to achieve 17 points, now stands with two specific spearheads. Interesting that the Bible talks about that in Revelation, two beasts that were coming up. The second that we see from this 2015 agenda is now the Pope's encyclical. So now you're beginning to see the Pope moving into his own world, of which he will control, and you will begin to see a second beast rising up, which has the power and the military authority to take over the rest of the world, which will control the buying and the selling. You're at the beginning stages of that right now. The Rising Sea, this was began in 2015, was an ecumenical gathering of pulling all the religious leaders together. Since that time, he's pulled together different religions from around the world, including the Muslim nation, and in 2 big meetings in the Middle East. Revelation 17 says this, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of the names of blasphemy, having the 7 heads and the 10 horns." This is talking about the rising sea and the Pope's 2030 agenda. What are we talking about with the seas? Remember I told you earlier, the seas normally represent armies rising up. Quite often the Bible used the term the seas as a reference to foreign nations or armies. Take a look at this. This is in Isaiah. It says, "Woe to the many nations that rage, and they rage like a raging sea. Woe to the peoples who roar, they roar like the roaring of great waters." All right, we're talking about a nation. Jeremiah 51. "The Lord will destroy Babylon, and he will silence her noisy din. The ways of her enemies will rage like great waters, and the roar of their voices will resound." All right, one more scripture here in Jeremiah 47. So this is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines before Pharaoh attacked Gaza. So this is what the Lord says. "See how the waters are rising in the north. They will become an overflowing torrent. They will overflow the land and everything in it, the towns and those who live in them, and the people will cry out, and all who dwell in the land will wail." Isn't it interesting how much the green people talk about the rise of the sea and how it's going to flood all the coastlines? All right, that's the physical, what is Satan using to divert the mindset of the spiritual that's taking place right before their very eyes. These enemies are rising like the seas, while the glory of Ephraim is being destroyed. In fact, it was Ephraim, and through the presidency of Donald Trump, that held off all of this taking place 4 years ago when he pulled out of that accord. Because what they needed to begin the development of this program was money. And when the United States pulled out, it slowed down what they really needed to get this thing going, which we will go back to now, entering back into those accords. By the way, that $2.3 trillion has nothing to do with that. The green now needs another $2 to $3 trillion that they're going to pass after the new administration comes in. Those are things that we're looking at that the world does not want to talk about, but they are real. This is how it begins in 2021. Big business gets its wings as leaders from the major U.S. companies partner with Pope Francis. Now he's beginning to put together. Remember I told you, history repeating itself. Hitler began his war in 1939, but he had already began going into other countries. So for 6 years behind the scenes, he was building a war machine, building his planes, his tanks, his arsenal, his ships, and his weapons. For 6 years till he was ready to attack. The Pope has been doing the same thing since 2015. He has been very, very busy. And now he's ready to begin his attack. How do you do it? You begin to change the mindset of the nations, to change their governing power and their policies, and you begin to take them down. Remember, we're fighting a spiritual war here. It says capitalism met Catholicism on Tuesday, this was December 15th, as some of the world's biggest business investment leaders announced a new partnership with Pope Francis, a brand new partnership with the Pope. So he's going to govern how they begin to rule. This beast who sits on 7 hills now is rising up. The alliance known as the Council of Inclusive Capitalism with the Vatican aims to create a more inclusive, fair, sustainable economic landscape by taking pledges toward Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, that was began in 2015, focused on areas such as climate action, peace and justice, equality, education, and gender equality. Isn't it amazing that he's asking for all of these things, including gender equality, while we in our stimulus package to help us through this COVID crisis have decided we're going to borrow money, we're going to give it to these other nations for what? Gender equality. And it doesn't mean just women, as they're trying to say here. They're talking about making gender neutral, gender equality, all the gays, all the transgenders, all of this, giving them a voice around the world. That's what it actually means. That's what's going on right now. The Pope just signed this accord with these 27 countries to do all of that. And what they're doing, and we, as a bunch of idiots, borrow money that we don't have to give to people who shouldn't have it. Well, let's go on. The council comprises 27 core members known as the Guardians. But I love that. The Guardians of Inclusive Capitalism. Well, if you're inclusive, right, that means everybody. Why do you need guardians? Isn't that like having a wall? Isn't that well, if we did it over here, or if this president would have done it, they would have called it racist. What are you talking about, guardians? Everybody's supposed to be equal. Isn't that what we're told? So now they have created 27 nations to be guardians who represent companies with over $2.1 trillion in market capitalization, and over 200 million workers. All beginning to take place right now, 2021, coming up. We need to be aware, brethren. We need to wake up, because 2020 year, I believe, is going to be the year we begin to see all the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall in place and begin to move as one machine. All accomplishing the goal of 2030 to take over this world. Institute the Babylonian system that God warned us about, where you and I will never be able to buy or sell with it, and to bring about the beast in Revelation. Anyway, that's what you're looking at. We're at the beginning of that stage right now. Oh, I forgot to change the date. This was last week's date. Should be January 1st, 2021. So last week in the mail, we sent out the choice and the sermon by Chuck Hunt called Conduct Worthy. It's actually going out this week. Coming up this week is going out this week in the mail. Also last week, we sent out the newsletter. It's actually a quarterly. It's our magazine. Began with the lead article, November 3rd, 2020, the second Pearl Harbors, or attack on our nation, through all the corruption that went through on that. And the sermon that I delivered just last month, the breach of America's walls. So if you're not on the mailing list yet, and you're tuning in every week, and we know thousands of people are tuning in every week, we appreciate and we thank you very much for that. Get on the mailing list. Every month we send out a newsletter, and every month we have a free DVD offering. So and keep you posted on what's going on with the church, for the Church of God Ministries International, which is the sponsor for this program, by the way. All right, sermon outline. These are online, and this time of year I put these up. These were given a couple years ago, because it pulls in Satan's Trinity. The Christmas, Mardi Gras, and Easter. 3 pagan customs that this world keeps, which are the anchors for Christianity, believe it or not. And they're all tied in to paganism, and Satan has put a counterfeit out there. You need to get these sermons. You can go online and you can look at them right now. Just look for the little symbols. December 25th, the day of the invincible sun. The biblical mystery of Mardi Gras, and the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on mankind, which is Easter. Very, very enlightening. So if you're new to the church or to the faith, you need to see what these sermons have to say. This coming week, we have some newlyweds. They were actually married right before the feast last year. Joe and Melody Schuster. They will be here, a guest speaker. Joe will deliver the sermon this coming Sabbath. So if you don't have a sermon anywhere to go to for services this week, tune in. We'll be live streaming this week, and welcome them to New Orleans for the first time since, I believe, around 2006. It'll be the first time that Joe's been in New Orleans. All right, that's it for our program today. So we want to do as we do every single week. We'll close our program with a real upbeat video, or uplifting video. This week it's called Work for His Glory. Take a look, and I'll be back in just a moment. Boy, don't you love that beat? And just really, really upbeat. Work for His glory. So that's the way, when you get up in the morning, that's the way we all want to be. And I'm sure we are each and every week. I know this team, when we come in, are just that way sometimes. Just kidding. 2021 is going to be a busy and probably a very concerning year for all of us. So we need to keep attuned to the news. We hope that you'll watch our program every week because there's a lot of information there. And God tells us when we see all these things begin to come past, we need to look up, lift our head high because we know that salvation draws near. Well, that's it. That's our first program for 2021. Hope you got something out of it. And if you did, share it with someone. Make sure you share this program with everyone you know. They will love you for it or not. Till next week, we hope everyone has a great New Year's weekend. God bless, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.